A lot of men completely misunderstand what actually makes a woman miss them after a breakup. Their first instinct is usually to stay visible, stay emotionally available, or constantly remind her they still exist. They think if they disappear, she will forget them. But psychologically, people rarely miss what never truly leaves their emotional space. Constant access removes emotional tension completely. That is why chasing, over-explaining, and staying emotionally present after a breakup often pushes attraction even further away instead of rebuilding it. What actually changes the dynamic is distance combined with emotional control. Not manipulation, not fake indifference, but genuine restraint. When a woman suddenly loses emotional access to a man she expected would still orbit around her, something psychologically shifts. Her mind starts noticing the absence differently, and that is where emotional curiosity begins growing quietly. The goal is not forcing her back. The goal is changing how she emotionally experiences your absence over time, psychologically. One of the strongest psychological moves after a breakup is disappearing quietly without making dramatic announcements or emotional speeches. Most men react emotionally after separation because they feel desperate to regain control. They send long paragraphs, over-explain themselves, apologize repeatedly, or try forcing emotional closure immediately. But what they fail to understand is that over-explaining removes the very thing that creates emotional pull after a breakup: uncertainty. Once you explain every feeling, every reason, and every emotion completely, there is nothing left for her mind to wonder about anymore. But when you quietly step away instead, something much more powerful begins happening psychologically. At first, she may feel relief because emotional tension has finally stopped, but eventually her brain notices something missing. She expected emotional reactions, chasing, or attempts to reconnect. When those reactions never arrive, unanswered questions begin forming internally, and unanswered emotional questions often stay alive far longer than emotional explanations ever do. When you disappear calmly after a breakup instead of emotionally chasing, memory slowly begins shifting in your favor psychologically. This happens because you're no longer constantly reinforcing the negative emotions attached to the breakup itself. Without your needy behavior interrupting her emotional processing, her mind naturally starts filtering memories differently over time. The arguments, tension, and emotional frustration slowly lose intensity while the comfort, familiarity, emotional safety, and connection become easier for her to remember. This is why silence can feel so powerful psychologically after separation. Silence creates space for emotional reflection. Most men ruin this process by constantly reaching out whenever anxiety appears internally. But that urge to contact her is usually not about love. It is about discomfort with losing emotional control. Acting on that anxiety may temporarily calm you down emotionally, but it destroys the uncertainty that often rebuilds attraction later. Emotional restraint becomes powerful because silence itself starts creating emotional pressure naturally over time. After a breakup, a woman usually creates an internal story explaining why the relationship ended and why leaving felt necessary emotionally. That story helps her move forward without constantly second-guessing herself psychologically. But here is what many men fail to understand. Every time you chase, argue, over-explain, or emotionally react, you strengthen that story in her mind. You confirm the exact emotional image she already has of you. But when your behavior suddenly stops matching her expectations, psychological tension appears internally. If she believed you were emotionally dependent, needy, or unstable, yet you remain calm, disciplined, and emotionally controlled after the breakup, her internal narrative begins weakening naturally. This creates cognitive dissonance because her story no longer fully matches reality anymore. And when people experience that emotional contradiction, they eventually begin questioning their certainty. That is why your behavior after the breakup matters far more than emotional speeches ever could. Real emotional shifts happen slowly, through observation, not persuasion or desperate explanations. One of the most effective ways to shift how a woman remembers you after a breakup is upgrading your life quietly instead of performatively. Many men immediately start trying to prove something after separation. They flood social media with gym photos, lifestyle changes, and forced success, hoping she notices everything instantly. But if the motivation behind all of it is still emotional validation from her, the energy feels performative instead of authentic. Real growth looks different psychologically. Quiet growth changes your identity gradually from the inside outward. You become more structured, disciplined, emotionally stable, and focused without needing constant external attention for it. Over time, people naturally notice the difference anyway, maybe through mutual friends, unexpected interactions, or subtle changes in your energy and lifestyle. The key is that it no longer feels like you are trying to impress her specifically. It feels like you genuinely entered a new phase of life emotionally. And that realization becomes much harder to ignore psychologically later. A quiet upgrade after a breakup usually appears in three important areas first: structure, focus, and emotional control. Most men become emotionally chaotic after separation. Their routines collapse, sleep gets worse, motivation disappears, and their energy becomes scattered everywhere psychologically. But a man rebuilding himself quietly becomes more disciplined instead of less. He returns to structure, his routines sharpen, he trains consistently, works consistently, and regains emotional balance gradually over time. That structure creates internal stability, and stability naturally creates confidence. Confidence is not something loudly announced, it is something emotionally felt by people around you. Focus matters just as much. Instead of obsessing over the breakup constantly, he redirects energy toward building himself again. And emotionally controlled men become unforgettable because they stop reacting impulsively to pain. They process emotions privately while continuing forward productively. Women notice this difference deeply because emotional discipline communicates strength far louder than emotional performance ever realistically could after separation psychologically. Another major mistake men make after breakups is remaining emotionally available without receiving the same emotional commitment in return. After separation, familiarity still exists, so many women eventually reach out casually. Sometimes it is a random message, a meme, a late-night conversation starter, or simple emotional checking. Most men instantly mistake this for reconciliation and emotionally rush back into the same dynamic immediately. But psychologically, many times she is not offering commitment, she is testing access. She wants to know whether she can still reach you emotionally whenever she feels lonely, uncertain, or nostalgic. And if you immediately become fully available again, she never experiences your absence deeply enough to miss you emotionally. You unintentionally allow yourself to become emotional convenience instead of emotional value. Women rarely miss men who remain permanently accessible after relationships end. They miss men whose emotional presence once mattered deeply, but is no longer available in the same comfortable way psychologically anymore. This is why emotional discipline becomes so important after a breakup. Many men become afraid that if they stop responding quickly or emotionally pulling her closer, she will disappear forever. But honestly, that fear often reveals emotional dependency more than genuine connection psychologically. If the only thing keeping her attached was convenience and constant emotional access, then your availability was never truly rebuilding attraction anyway. It was only delaying emotional reality while weakening your position slowly over time. But when there is still genuine emotional investment on her side, your absence eventually becomes noticeable internally. She starts realizing she no longer has the same emotional access she once took for granted. That disruption creates curiosity, uncertainty, and sometimes emotional anxiety. Suddenly, the dynamic changes because your energy no longer feels predictable or constantly available. And psychologically, people often begin valuing emotional presence more once they realize it cannot be accessed whenever they want anymore, without real commitment attached to it. The most important shift of all is genuinely moving on emotionally, instead of pretending to move on strategically. Many men try performing emotional detachment while secretly obsessing internally over whether every action will bring their ex back. But psychologically, energy always reveals emotional attachment eventually. If your entire focus still revolves around her reactions, your emotional center still belongs to her completely. Real healing begins when your life stops orbiting around the relationship outcome itself. You stop checking her social media constantly. You stop replaying conversations searching for hidden meanings. You stop emotionally analyzing every possibility in your head repeatedly. Instead, you begin redirecting energy into rebuilding your own life fully again. Your health, environment, social life, mindset, goals, and experiences start expanding beyond the breakup emotionally. The larger your life becomes, the smaller the emotional dependency grows internally. And that emotional independence completely changes how people experience your presence psychologically afterward. At the end of the day, you cannot force someone to miss you by holding on to them tighter emotionally. People begin missing you when they genuinely feel the loss of your emotional presence, your energy, your consistency, and your value in their life. That only happens when access changes completely. Most men stay emotionally available after breakups because they are terrified of losing connection permanently. But ironically, constant availability usually removes the very emotional tension capable of rebuilding attraction later. Real power comes from emotional control, quiet growth, discipline, and genuinely rebuilding your life beyond the relationship itself. And if a woman eventually comes back after all of that, the dynamic feels completely different psychologically, because you are no longer operating from desperation or emotional dependency anymore. You become someone choosing connection instead of needing it. That emotional shift changes everything internally. And honestly, that is what makes people remember you long after relationships end. Do well to subscribe because you are important.